We'll start. We've waited, I think, long enough now. A couple of housekeeping points, really, if you like, before we go on to this evening's talk. This is the last talk of 2017. The programme for next year is out, and I think you got a copy of that the last time you came along. And you have a flyer for the first talk. We'll start. We've waited, I think, long enough now. A couple of housekeeping points, really, if you like, before we go on to this evening's talk. This is the last talk of 2017. The programme for next year is out, and I think you got a copy of that the last time you came along. And you have a flyer for the first talk of 2018. Dr. Emily Mayhew, who's giving the lecture, the talk, wrote a book called Wounded, which we had on sale in the museum. They've been snaffled up and gone. Come to the lecture and listen to what she has to say, and we'll have some more copies of the book ready for you to buy if you like it. But it should be a fascinating lecture. It is the story, if you would like to call it a story, of how the medical evacuation chain developed as a result of the experience of the First War. And it covers stretcher bearers, collecting people from the battlefield where they've been wounded. It goes back to the first dressing stations, through the surgeons, through the evacuation train on using trains through France, across the channel on boats, onto trains again, how the people who came back on those trains were then unloaded at Waterloo and Victoria, and quite often left on the platform because the train had to go back to pick up more wounded, and these poor chaps were left on the platform lying on their stretchers until such time that some buses could pick them up and take them off to the base hospitals around about the place. I'm going to be fascinated because one of my father's earliest memories as a Boy Scout was going onto the platform with a packet of cigarettes and giving all these wounded people who were lying on their stretchers cigarettes, which they gratefully received. Anyway, that's the first one of the coming year, and the rest of the programme I hope will entertain you. Particularly, I hope Leo Aylan, the poet who's coming along, and he's going to give us some of his poems. And the subject of his talk, if I remember rightly, was thank you, Rifleman, I've got the guy's name now, for rescuing me. Should be a good talk. He's a fairly strange chapter, but I think most poets are. But on to this evening, we're very lucky to have Geoffrey Vesey-Holt with us, who's come through the mud and the blood to the green fields beyond to get here this evening. And the significance of that phrase will, I'm sure, come out during the course of the lecture. But there are some senior Royal Tank Regiment officers amongst you who are all set to give Geoffrey a hard time if he gets it wrong, but I'm sure he won't. He's a very experienced historian and a former officer of the Royal Tank Regiment, and we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say, Geoffrey. Thank you.
Thank you, very kind. If I look slightly haggard, it's not just the combination of Southern and whatever Southwestern Railways are now called. It's because I was doing a lecture similar in style to the Army and Navy yesterday evening, and I then went back home because I had to translate, of course, a large, I'm a French interpreter, I had to translate a large amount of paperwork which was being produced by the regiment because, of course, it's the centenary of the Battle of Cambrai, and you can imagine how much correspondence is going on between the French and the British at the moment, including translating the Mayor of Cambrai's CV and explaining what it meant to a minister, which is, I can tell you, quite complicated, even if you know France quite well. I'm going to take you back to the 13th of December 1917. We are in F Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Frank Summers, who's the man in the middle, aged 46, is about to leave his battalion to form a new battalion in the UK as part of the expansion of the Tank Corps in late 1917, early 1918. I suspect he had a very considerable hangover because two of his company commanders were very experienced soldiers like himself. He fought in the Boer War. He joined the Royal Marines, which is why he had a DSO and a DSC, very rare, on there in 1914. and he'd commanded one of the first 2 tank companies in history, to be precise, D Company, at the Battle of Flers in September 1916. So he is a rare example of an experienced tank man in late 1916. The 2 company commanders, the man on the left there is a man called Inglis. Inglis joined the army at 17. He's a regular soldier. He actually fought in Africa through most of the beginning of the First World War. By the way, the first round fired of the British Army was actually fired in Africa, if you want to win a quiz competition. Asked me what, I can't remember who it was, but I can tell you what nationality he was, and he was in the British Army on there. He comes back to UK in 1916, and he joins what is then the heavy section of the Machine Gun Corps to command a section of 3 tanks at the Battle of Flers. He wins a DSO for that. He's only a captain. That's quite a considerable award for a captain on there. And he joins F Battalion as a company commander. Company is 12 tanks on that. To the right, the man who looks as though he's got a hangover, and he probably does have a hangover, named Philip Hammond. By the way, it's not a relation of, is he still the Charles Edward Chapter? Resist that one. On that one, it makes French politics positively stable, as a quick aside on there. Philip Hammond, he's aged 36. He has an even more interesting background necessary than the other 2, which is he joins the British Army in 1903 and the Boer War. He's aged 17. He wins a DSO at 18. There is no military cross. Remember, the military cross only comes into existence at the beginning of the First World War, 1914-15 on there. So it's an exceptional award. He's the youngest officer to win the DSO in the British Army at that date. He serves in the Norfolks until 1909, and I suspect because he was bored of peacetime soldiering, he's that kind of bloke. He leaves the regular army, and of course he rejoins it immediately in 1914. He serves in 7 Norfolks. He wins an MC for an act of immediate courage while he's fighting with the Norfolks, and then I suspect he got bored with being an infantryman. It was just too easy, and he joins the Tank Corps. He joins the Tank Corps, which was slightly more risky, I have to say. Well, marginally, you can ask me a question about that one at the end of all this. And he becomes a company commander, serving in F Battalion as well. And we know that he must have had a slight hangover, because he admits himself that when he went into action at the Battle of Cambrai, which is of course on foot, he was half cut on run on there, and he wrote some very evocative letters to his wife. When he left the army after the First World War, he did a number of interesting things. He defrocked a priest. I'm not joking on there, and the priest was in the end killed by a lion. That's another story on there. I'm not joking. And he finishes his life as a very passable Norfolk folk singer with quite a good Norfolk accent. He was quite well known, and you could find him on YouTube actually on there. So he's quite a character, it's Philip Hammond. Why is Summers in the middle wearing a brassard? That's probably because his son was killed at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. So these are very experienced soldiers, and one can imagine them nursing a substantial hangover, having dined out Summers on the 12th of December, saying, what the blazes has just happened? Not only have we won a major battle, but we've been through the most extraordinary journey from when the first tank went into action, remember that's September 1916, to fighting the Battle of Cambrai, which is only 14 months effectively after that. And we can imagine them discussing this, and the first thing that they probably remarked was the extraordinary achievement about Cambrai itself. On the 20th of November 1917, at 6:20, which is 51 minutes before sunrise, in other words, there's enough light to operate without too many problems, even at that time of the year, just over 1,000 guns suddenly open up on a quiet front where nothing ever happened. The Germans called it the Cornbread Sanatorium. And the next thing that hits the Germans is nearly 400 tanks running straight over their positions. Within about 4 hours, the whole of the two Hindenburg lines, and I'll talk about them in some detail in a minute, are overrun. And at midday on the 23rd of November, for the one and only time in the First World War, the bells ring throughout England on that. Although I have to say that the archivists of both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York couldn't actually find any information on that. It's an interesting comment on archives on there. And that's the only time it happens. The only other two times it happens at the edges of the First World War, at the beginning and at the end, on there. So this is a remarkable victory, and it took the Germans completely by surprise. Why? Because they expected the normal British 48-hour preliminary bombardment, which was fundamentally to cut the wire. And I'll explain in a minute, this is not little bits of wire, as you do wire things, these are massive fortifications with vast amounts of wire. And there are really, in the First World War, only two ways of cutting large amounts of wire. Either you use a very large quantity of artillery, which after 1916 uses a fuse called the 106 fuse, and if you suffer from insomnia, I recommend the Wikipedia 4-page instruction on how functions the 106 fuse. I suspect I'm the only person to have ever read it, but it is actually quite a useful reference. The other way, of course, you can cut the wire is you run a 30-ton tank straight over it. Right? And that actually is one of the prime functions of First World War British heavy tanks. It's the one people always forget on that. So for the Germans, this comes as a total surprise. And this is critical because what's happened is that surprise has returned to the battlefield. And the contrast with other battles is quite striking. If we take the Hindenburg lines, just to explain the fortifications, at the top there is a village called Flers. Those of you who know your Cambrai battlefield will know that that is where D-51 Deborah, which is the only tank that's ever been dug up from the battlefield, is about to go into a museum next door to the Flers Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery. And by the way, if you stand at Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery and look north, you are looking over where Lord Gort won his VC. I am, of course, talking about Lord Gort VC, DSM bar, MC and bar, wounded 3 times, 8 mentions and dispatches. Right, and without any doubt the bravest man in the British Army in the First World War. On there, he becomes a Field Marshal in the Second World War, different story on there. The Hindenburg Line consists of 2 enormous fortified systems, which the Germans reckoned were impregnable. And the reason why the Germans reckoned that they were impregnable was because each Hindenburg Line consisted of 2 trenches wide enough to stop a Mark IV tank from crossing it, so over 3 metres wide. So they are in fact anti-tank ditches. There is a fire step for the infantry at the front on them. In front of that is a wire belt about 100 metres deep. Now I'm not talking about any namby-pamby wire belt, I'm talking something my height, with coils that width, and a 30-ton tank driving over them bounces up a bit. There is so much wire. Right. The tank clears it good enough for the infantry to go past, but the cavalry, of course the horses require much more genteel stuff, had to have proper corridors cleared, and they were cleared by dismounted cavalry detachments, and I'm certain they didn't volunteer for that task on the way, and also by special wire-pulling tanks with enormous grapplings on the side. Not only do you have this full fortified system, but within the fortified system you have bunkers. The bunkers are for machine guns and for artillery observers on the rear Hindenburg line, so the gap between the 2 Hindenburg lines becomes an enormous killing zone. To make things worse for the attacker, if you're British, you can't see the first Hindenburg line. It's in dead ground to you. So you're advancing to a line that's in dead ground to you, and then the next thing you are is hit by German artillery. And I'll give you an example of just how devastating the Hindenburg line could be. So this was a major military obstacle. And please note, that's 4 anti-tank ditches that can keep out a Mark IV tank. So in theory, it's impregnable. And that gives you a feel for what it looks like. That's in fact in 1918. That's British transport going through the Hindenburg Line after we breached the Hindenburg Line, of course, for the second time. A really amazing military feat, by the way, in September 1918, which nobody ever talks about, which is a shame, because it's a gruelling fight, and the Germans capitulate virtually at the end of that because they realise they'd lost the war on that. And that gives you an idea of what the wire entanglements look like. Let's just compare that to a conventional battle. This is the Battle of Passchendaele, third Battle of Ypres, technically, on the 31st of July 1917. So we are only months before Cambrai. We lost 31,000 casualties, and so few prisoners were taken that I can't find in the official history the number of prisoners taken on the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres on there. To take the same ground as we took in one day at Cambrai, that's that little red arrow, took from the 31st of July to the 20th of September. Right, 6 weeks roughly on there, and a lot more casualties. At Cambrai, we take 4,000 prisoners, we suffer 4,000 casualties, and since the Germans will have probably suffered roughly the same number of casualties, that means the Germans are losing twice as many troops as we are. Now, you've lost the war if you're the defender in the First World War, if you're losing twice as many troops as the attacker. And by the way, the second piercing of the Hindenburg Line and the Battle of Amiens in August 1918 have roughly the same statistics. So the Germans have lost the war on this. And this is the proof of concept for doing it. Now, I'm sure that Summers would have talked about why the tank. Now, the tank is one but a series of measures that is trying to resolve a fundamental problem of the First World War. And what I'm going to say here is obvious, but needs to be said many times just to understand how difficult the problem that senior officers had to resolve, particularly in the British Army. And that is the enormous power of the defence. Artillery, if you compare Waterloo, which is after all the last really major war we fought, and is only 100 years before the First World War, so it's the same distance as we are from the First World War. Artillery has gone from something that can just about take out a man at 1,000 metres to something that can comfortably, even with field artillery, take out a man at about 4 kilometres and can do so now without having to see the target. Not only have you got a vast increase in the potential of artillery, but the weapons that are being used at Cambrai throughout the First World War are smokeless, unlike at Waterloo, where as soon as you've got your 500 men to open fire with their muskets, because the propellant is of low quality, you've got a lot of smoke in the battlefield. You get none of that, of course, in the First World War. And not only that, that gun below, which by the way is a Lewis gun, which curiously is an American design but was never used by the American Army because the senior American general and Lewis could not get on with each other as a smaller side. One Lewis gun probably produces about the same amount of firepower as 500 infantrymen firing muskets at the Battle of Waterloo. And it does it at a range that's probably something like 3 times the range. So the lethality of even the infantry has vastly increased compared to Waterloo. To make things even worse, barbed wire, which was of course is a Swedish patent as an aside, and was actually invented in order to rapidly create artificial hedges in the far west, and it was immediately identified as being a very successful obstacle to the whole system. Not only does the attacker have all that to deal with, but he has 2 major disadvantages in First World War terms. One, which people often forget, is that this is a horse-borne, mule-borne army. If you take 4th British Army, which is the army that breaches the Hindenburg Line in September 1918, it has 15 divisions. It has about 100,000 animals, of which about 30,000 are mules or donkeys. It only has 1,500 trucks. So if you're the attacker, you've got to get those animals across no man's land and to advance. The defender can use the railway system, which means he can rapidly move reserves almost as quickly, frankly, as we can now. We have much more difficulty if we're attacking to do the same thing. The second problem is communications. This is a pigeon being let out of a tank, in case you wondered. Each tank carried 2 pigeons, and the pigeons apparently may actually quite like being in a tank because they had a little rocking movement on there. And the 2 key forms of communication in the First World War are pigeons and a telephone. And in March 1918, we bury a telephone wire 6 foot underground, and the Germans take out our telephone system because they have shells that can penetrate 6 foot. So our entire communication system gets destroyed. Pigeons are used extensively, and as a quick aside, in the 100 days when we're actually advancing against the Germans, we advance at an average rate of about 3 miles a day. The pigeons can't keep up with the movement of the dovecotes, because they have to move, of course, every day on there, and there were hundreds of thousands of pigeons used quite successfully there. Radios cannot be used in the way that they're used in the Second World War in armoured vehicles. They are used in aircraft for spotting by the end of the period. So technology is very much against the attacker. And the tank, as Summers would have reminded the other two bloke, was one of the ways in which you resolve the problem of attacking. This is mother, of course. It should be father because it's got a gun. Male tanks have 2 6-pounder guns. Female tanks have machine guns. I'll leave to your imagination why they're called like that. And before somebody asks me, there are hermaphrodite tanks in 1918, and that is a tank that has one male sponson, i.e. that thing that projects from the side there, and one female sponson on the other side. But they did that because they discovered the Germans had tanks with guns, and therefore they needed to have lots of tanks with guns on there. The wheel at the back is a complete waste of time, and Summers would have said that this is the Mark I, it's a remarkable achievement. If you think that in late 1914 we didn't even know we required a tank, and that in January 1916 we produce a tank that works amazingly. There are lots of things wrong with it, I'll come back to that in a minute. Now think about that one. I spent, for my misfortune, 15 years in weapons procurement, and there is no way we would be able to do that now. To go from nothing to producing something that works, why does it work? I'll come on to that in a minute. In basically about 14 months is quite extraordinary. Why does it work? Because the two designers were brilliant. There's Tritton and Wilson on there. Tritton designs the track, right? Absolutely critical, right? Because that's the thing that spreads the weight. And the width of a Mark I British tank track is the same width as that of Challenger 2. And that is not a coincidence. It is because that is the optimum width you can get for a track. Wilson designed the shape. You might think that doesn't look like a tank, does it? Because the guns are on the side. The reason why is because the priority was to have a vehicle that could move across very difficult ground. So you don't want a turret, because turrets push the height up, so the centre of gravity is too high. You want the sponsons, because they help balance the vehicle on both sides. You want the vehicle as long as possible, because that gets you across large trenches. You want that step at the front, because that enables you to climb substantial bits of hills. And the ground pressure of a Mark IV, or a Mark I for that matter, is about half that of a modern main battle tank. Right, so this can go places that a modern main battle tank couldn't go. It is a very, very clever design, so clever that the final version, the Mark V, the French actually bought 2 regiments worth. And for the French to buy, I did the French Staff College, for the French to buy foreign kit is quite extraordinary. It must be really good. The design is clever also because what they did is the external packaging is completely innovative. But the internal components are generally components that were taken from industry. Now you pay a price for that, getting us in service. There is no silencer on a Mark I. For some unknown reason, they put the fuel tanks at the front of the vehicle in an unarmoured box, which is not a good idea, but then the Sherman tank suffered from that early on there. And there are a whole series of second-order defects, like it's grossly underpowered. The engine, I guess, looking at you, that probably most of you have got cars and got engines twice the size of the Mark I tank. I'm not joking, it's 105 brake horsepower. The largest engine you can get in the First World War is about 200 brake horsepower, and that's the maximum on there. You need 3 men to change gears, because it's got 3 gearboxes, because they couldn't find a gearbox man enough to take a 30-ton tank, so they had to take effectively 3 15-ton gearboxes. And changing gear is a complete nightmare that requires 2 people to do it, so you don't do it in a rush on that. However, basically it works. This is truthfully a pre-production tank. It's put almost immediately into action, 15th of September 1916. 50 tanks are sent to go into action, only 30 actually reach the front line. Considering that they were supporting an army that had 12 divisions, so probably about twice the size of the British Army currently, 30 tanks weren't going to do all that much. But it was a useful proof of concept. But it was quite clear when they came out of it that they were going to have to do a bit more to get the tank successful. So they did 2 things 14 days after the Battle of Flers Courcelette on the 15th of September. On the 29th of September, they did 2 things. One is Haig told the War Office to issue a contract to buy 1,000 tanks. In the best traditions of the British Army, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff immediately cancelled that contract on the grounds he said that the tanks were a rash idea that might not work. And Lloyd George, who was the Minister of Munitions, cancelled the cancellation. So I might not trust my wife with Lloyd George, but we have got something to be grateful to Lloyd George for. Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister after that, which gives you an idea of the importance, by the way, of being Minister of Munitions on that. The contract, interestingly, was never actually built because there wasn't time to build it. And before somebody asks the obvious question, most tanks were actually built by the Birmingham Bus Company, of all people, because they had spare industrial capacity on them. The second thing they do is they appoint the man on the left. The paintings, by the way, are by Sir William Orpen. Right, if you wonder, a very evocative set of paintings that William Orpen, who went round, and he went to HQ Tank Corps, and in his diary he says that HQ Tank Corps was so hospitable that he got leglessly drunk one night, as a small aside, on there. And he paints these two evocative paintings. On the left is Ellis, a major when he starts the war, a major general when he finishes the war, the commander of the Tank Corps throughout the First World War, a very charismatic man indeed. And I'll quote from Fuller, and I'll explain Fuller in a minute. He says, "It was a great brotherhood, the Tank Corps, and if they were duds, they were certainly not old ones. For the commander of the corps, Major General, that's in 1918, Ellis, was under 40, and most of his staff and subordinate commanders were younger than himself. Youth is apt, rightly, to be enthusiastic, and General Ellis must frequently have had a trying time in regulating their enthusiasm, canalising it forward against the enemy and backwards diplomatically against our friends. On the G staff, this is Fuller talking, there was myself, and under me was Major F.E. Hotblack, the man on the right, DSO and Bar, two DSOs, MC, and he wins a second MC in September 1918, MC and Bar, wounded 3 times, as an aside, on there. And Fuller says that Hotblack was a lover of beauty in battles, a mixture of Abelard and Marshal Ney. Napoleon, remember, said that Ney was the brave des braves, the brave of the brave. On their boots, he was called Boots because he always had a beautifully polished pair of boots, irrespective of what he did. Combined the qualities of intellect and bravery of HQ Tank Corps. He was aged 29 in 1916, which makes him quite old, by the way, as an aside on there. He'd been educated at he was a brewer by background. He was educated at the Imperial Service College, at Lausanne University. On there, he joins the Norfolks in 1914, and he goes straight to what is the nascent intelligence corps. He's then selected by Haig to be the intelligence and reconnaissance officer for HQ Tank Corps. So his tasks, amongst other things, was actually laying the tape, and there's special tank tape. Tank tape is white tape with a black line going through it, so you don't confuse it with infantry tape, which was white. And the reason why you had to tape the routes is because if you've got a tank that does 3 miles an hour top speed, and all your moves had to take place at night in very low gear, you absolutely don't want to get lost. So the only way you could do it was that at tank corps level, at brigade level, at battalion level, and at company level, there were specially trained reconnaissance officers, one of whose tasks was to lay the tape forward so that the tanks could follow between the tapes. And the other problem, of course, with the tanks was you had to make sure you cleared the route to avoid too many telephones and all the other things that tanks normally destroy as they bimble their way across the battlefield on that. Hotblack's a remarkable man in more ways than one. Let me just read you his DSO. It says, to one of his DSO, sorry, it's the bar to his DSO. It says, this officer been present throughout the 4 great battles, Messines, Ypres and Cambrai of the year, that's 1917, except Arras, where he was wounded on the first day. He has shown throughout persistent gallantry and contempt for danger in the pursuance of his duty as a reconnaissance and battle liaison officer, which has been an inspiration to all ranks. Now, Hotblack is only one amongst a large number of brave soldiers in the Tank Corps. There were 4 VCs, 82 DSOs, 489 MCs, 146 DCMs, and 623 MMs out of a crew size that can never have exceeded about 5,000 maximum. These 2 key steps were then linked to an expansion of the Tank Corps to take it from the 50 tanks to 9 battalions, and that gives you the 9 battalions that go into action at the Battle of Cambrai, just under 400 tanks. Those brigades are commanded by equally interesting men. This is Brigadier General, at that time, Brigadier General Courage, This is Fuller speaking about courage. He says he possessed only half a jaw, having lost the rest at Ypres. And yet at conferences he was a host in himself. And what a powwow he must have been before the Boche bullet hit him could not even be found in the works of the great Munchausen. No detail escaped his eye, no trouble was too great, and no fatigue sufficient to suggest a pause. The success of Hamel and Murray in 1918 were due to his energy, and on these successes was the Battle of Amiens founded. The Battle of Amiens being, of course, the 8th of August 1918, what Ludendorff, and I am quoting him, described as the dark day of the German army. And interestingly, German official history says the worst defeat that the German army had suffered to date. Linked with that was the need to create esprit de corps, and I'll give you an example of how it was done. This is Ellis before the Battle of Cambrai. Ellis does two things. He issues Special Order Number 6, which was read for the first time on the 19th of November to all the battalions going into action, and of course read to the Royal Tank Regiment on the 20th of November to commemorate the battle. And I cannot resist reading it to you because it's a nice piece of prose. Tomorrow, the Tank Corps will have the chance for which has been waiting for many months to operate in good going in the van of the battle. All that hard work and ingenuity can achieve has been done in the way of preparation. It remains for unit commanders and for tank crews to complete the work by judgment and pluck in the battle themselves. In the light of past experience, I leave the good name of the Corps with great confidence in their hands. I propose leading the attack of the Centre Division. Hugh Ellis, Brigadier General, commanding Tank Corps, 19th of November 1917. Just before 6:20 on the 20th of November, Ellis arrived at H Battalion, which was the centre battalion of the order of battle. Carrying a stick, he unfurled a flag, and the flag was, of course, the Tank Corps flag, through the mud and the blood to the green fields beyond. He asked what the central tank was of H Battalion, and it was a tank with a slightly unfortunate name of Hilda. He knocks at the side of Hilda and gets into Hilda and rolls off into the distance. Now actually, Hilda then ditches in one of the Hindenburg Line ditches, and Ellis then walks back. But that's not the point, it's the symbolism that's the important thing. Because what he's looking forward to is to the Second World War, when armoured commanders will do it from their tanks, using radios. Of course, he doesn't have radios. And also, he's giving a message that senior commanders go forward, more common in the First World War than you might think on that. So this is a very significant gesture, which was noted by everybody. Now, linked with creating leadership and doing all the other things were the normal measures that you expect, like drill, sports, and all the other morale-enhancing measures, and you have to have a bit of training and doctrine, don't you? This is Fuller. Academics don't tend to like Fuller because he becomes a fascist for all intents and purposes in the 30s, but that is irrelevant to Fuller's performance in the First World War. A man of great brilliance, known as Boney, either because he was bald or because he thought he was Bonaparte. Nobody's quite sure which. And this is one of Fuller's own staff officers, a man called Foote, a really good book called Three Lives, which is fascinating for nothing to do with the First World War on there. Foote had done just about everything you could possibly think of, including quite a lot of fighting. And he was one of Fuller's staff officers. And that's what he says about Fuller. The brains behind it all were Fuller's. A flash of inspiration combined with faith may be responsible for initiating an invention. Skilled hands may forge it into a weapon. Gallant-hearted men may be ready to use it. Careful arrangements may bring the man and the weapon to the scene of action. All this is useless without the brains that direct the weapon's use. And that was Fuller's contribution. For their success, tanks require tactics no less than petrol. Fuller devised them. Before an attack can be launched, there must be a plan. Fuller made it. After an attack, lessons must be learnt both from success and failure. Fuller absorbed them. And sad to relate, in the case of the tanks, a constant war had been waged against the apathy, incredulity and short-sightedness of JHQ. Fuller fought that war and won on that. And Fuller, in late 1916, Fuller arrives in what becomes the Tank Corps. He gets all the officers together and runs a large cloth model exercise. On the basis of that, he issues the first guidance for how to actually fight a tank. And almost immediately after that, he issues a very detailed training directive which results in the creating of schools at Bovington and Larworth, which are the ones, of course, still exist, and a whole set of schools in France for gunnery, driving, compass training, and you name it, on top of that. Now, in addition to all that, you need a bit of logistics, of course. So there was a large tank corps administrative area around a place called Bullecourt, a rather smart chateau, by the way, with a nice restaurant, which I strongly recommend, on there, which is where HQ Tank Corps was. There's no point in being uncomfortable if you hadn't. And by the way, if you wonder why they took chateaus, that was part of the reason, was because that's the place where you've got a telephone, because telephones are quite rare, and gentlemen who live in chateaus tended to have telephones on there. And around there was a vast administrative area, which included baths. They were allowed one bath a week on there, cinemas, rest centres on there, and all the other panoplies so that tank units could be withdrawn, back, recover, the tanks be repaired and sent back into action. They also gradually put into action a very large number of supply tanks. What they did is they took obsolete Mark 1s and obsolete Mark 2s and 3s, took the sponsons off and made them carry large quantities of kit. And just to give you an idea, 4 supply tanks could carry the equivalent of 1,200 men. Right. So actually the supply tanks, of which by 1918 there are hundreds of them, are actually quite a significant contribution to victory on that. And finally, they create a proper salvage and maintenance system, which includes, for example, large numbers of Chinese indentured labour. We were running out of men, so one of the ways we got round it was to pay Chinese labour to come over, who do extensive repair, and they do something quite important just before the Battle of Cambrai. One of the things Fuller does is, remember we've got our 4 Hindenburg lines across? So are we going to get across them? We need 2 things. One is we need some means of filling the Hindenburg line quickly, and we need a drill. And what Fuller came up with was the brilliant idea of putting one of those great big bundles of sticks called a fascine. It's in fact 73 normal fascines bundled together. It weighs 1.5 tons. It's 10 foot wide. It's 4.5 foot in width, and you pull a lever inside the tank and it drops down the rail into the Hindenburg line. You then drive your tank, you drop like that, and you do what's called a knife edge, and you come up and off you go. That's if you're properly trained, of course. Once or twice they end up like that, for obvious reasons. And Fuller had laid out a detailed drill of what the tanks were to do to cross the Hindenburg line, and you do it in 2 waves, to be absolutely precise. So it's a real achievement, and the Chinese indentured labour managed to produce these in about 4 weeks. You'll see they're loading on rail flats. These are actually tanks going to the Battle of Cambrai. They're just about, they haven't quite finished moving because you have to push the sponsons right in to do that on there. They're then taken, if we took F Battalion unloads 13 miles from Cambrai. They then extremely quietly, in the lowest gear, doing about 0 miles an hour, drove at night to their laying up positions. In the case of F Battalion, it was a wrecked village called Bullecourt, where they camouflaged into the area, and then just before 6:20, they rumble their way through the night. They stop about 1,000 yards back from the front line, and at precisely 6:10, all the tanks open up and move forwards, because the Germans will not be able to react in 10 minutes. 1,000 yards back, you can't hear a tank if it's moving slowly, or can't hear a Mark 4 if it's moving slowly. So the devil's in the detail, and Fuller was a master of that detail. Clearly, you need a tank. So what they did, very clever, the Mark 4 is an improved Mark 1, but not too much improved. And I'll explain why that's important. What they do is it's got a silencer, that helps. It's got fuel tanks that are in an armoured box at the back of the vehicle, that helps. But the 2 of the major defects of the Mark 1 have not been resolved. It remains underpowered, and you've still got the problem of the gearboxes. And the reason why they haven't changed that is because it would have delayed production of sufficient numbers of tanks in 1917. And so therefore they decided that they would go for an intermediate design, which is a Mark 4, rather than trying to leap straight to the Mark 5. And that's the reason why you've got about 400 tanks at Cobra. So it's a very sensible compromise. You pay the price, but well-trained crews can cope with the price. The Mark 5, as an aside, has an engine about 1.5 times more powerful, and 1 man can steer it, as with a modern tank on there. The last thing that I'm sure that Hammond and Summers would have discussed is learning from experience. Now, Now, learning from experience, sadly, is the only real way you can prove whether or not your ideas actually work. And to get to Cambrai, the tanks went through a very hard process. Remember, at the Battle of Flers, only 50 tanks had started off, and only 30 went into action. As an aside, at Cambrai, all but about 2 tanks went into action out of the 400. So you can see the improvement in drills and the whole exercise going with it. Hammond and F Battalion were not at the Battle of Arras. Arras is only important for 2 reasons. One is it's the first brigade actioned by the Tank Corps, and the second reason is that a senior gunner, the Commander of Royal Artillery of 9th Division, a man called Henry Tudor, notes that the tanks might be of use to him. And in the late summer of 1917, before Cambrai, he suggests a plan, which is that the guns will open up just before the main attack goes in. And to do that, you need to crush the wire. So he comes up with what is actually the plan for Cambrai. So when somebody tells me that tanks were of no importance to the Battle of Cambrai, Henry Tudor, who's a gunner, would have disagreed completely with the person who said that, because the gun, it's all arms, isn't it? That you have to have the integrated battle. Of perhaps more significance is the Battle of Bullecourt. If you'd been Hammond at about 6:15, waiting for dawn and waiting for the guns to fire, you'd have seen just to your left a village hamlet called La Vecchierie. La Vecchierie is about the same size as the village of Bullecourt, and they were both redoubts, 45 redoubts in the Hindenburg Line. And that would have made you very, very nervous if you'd been Hammond, because to take Bullecourt had cost 20,000 casualties and repeated attacks on that. Actually, to take La Vecchierie, which is about the same size as Bullecourt, cost 100 casualties to the infantry and took about an hour. So again, it's a nice example of the fundamental change that's taken place in barely 6 months between Bullecourt and the capture of La Vecchierie. The Third Battle of Ypres is important for the Tank Corps because it's the first time all 3 tank brigades are used in action. It's a fairly unpleasant way of learning some extremely difficult lessons, and this is Hammond talking about his tanks going into action. F Battalion starts the battle with 36 tanks, and by the 9th of August it's down to 17. On the 22nd of August, Hammond's company, which is 12 tanks, remember, he's only got 9 left, as we'll see in a minute, goes into action. And this is Hammond's own description of what happens. As far as I could get it, Dad killed F-41 as a tank, was lost out in Bosch. He stopped there and fought it for 72 hours. 1 killed, 6 wounded, 1 untouched. A tank crew is 8 men, by the way. But shocked. He eventually brought back his gun locks and went back to the tank, but it had sunk quite deep, too deep to move. Peters, F-42, leg off himself, 1 killed and all the rest wounded. Tank sunk. Sam Harding, F-43, dead, 4 wounded, 3 okay, tank sunk. Fearless, F-46, dead, 3 wounded, 4 okay, tank sunk. Brooks with Arnold 2 on board, sunk out by Pond Farm and Highcott West. Brooks prisoner and escaped. Arnold wounded, Chester prisoner, 1 wounded, 3 missing, 3 prisoners as far as we know. Tank lost, sunk beyond Bosch. Fred Harris, F-47, 1 arm and 1 leg blown off, alive still, 4 wounded, 3 okay, tank sunk by Steinbeck. Philip, F-48, 1 wounded, tank sunk. Ireland, F-49, wounded, 1 killed, 2 wounded, tank sunk. Also 4 or 5 runners killed or wounded. I'm quoting Hammond here. He says, a pretty bloody butcher's bill all the way round. And again, note the contrast to Cambrai. It is a quite extraordinary one on that. Now, we followed the path that the tanks take to the Battle of Cambrai. And Cyril Falls, in his excellent short history of the Battle of Cambrai, which I strongly recommend to you, on there, describes Cambrai as the great experiment. And Cambrai is really the proof of concept which enables us to win the First World War in 1918. And in particular, the Battle of Amiens is effectively the Battle of Cambrai on steroids. It's about twice the distance to go forward. There are about the same number of tanks, about 470 fighting tanks, And that is a decisive defeat to the German army. The Germans themselves say that they lost 27,000 total, of which there were 12,000 prisoners, which is roughly the same number of prisoners as we suffered total casualties. So again, we're inflicting twice as many losses on the Germans as we've suffered ourselves. And it is a quite remarkable achievement on that. And that route that I've just been through is the key thing. Finally, I'm sure you'd like to know what happened to Somers, Inglis and Hammond. Sadly, Inglis is severely wounded on the 8th of August 1918 by a shell going off because one of his tanks ran over it, and he dies in 1919, partially as a result of his wounds. Hammond and Somers go to the United States to help form the American Tank Corps at Fort Bliss on there, and the commander of the Fort Bliss school, which is their training school, was going to command 301st American Tank Battalion, which is the only American tank battalion which fought with the British Army, interestingly, equipped with British Mark V's, and it takes part in the breach of the Hindenburg Line. And I'm sure that the 28-year-old Lieutenant Colonel who was going to command 301 and goes and commands the school wasn't too happy about that. Of course, he is Dwight D. Eisenhower, future Commander-in-Chief of Allied Armies 1944-45 and President of the United States. So at least Somers and Hammond were in good company. Thank you very much.
Right, fascinating. Gosh, your knowledge and your delivery is absolutely amazing. Questions, ladies and gentlemen? Anyone back?
When you went through that list of casualties, every tank sank.
It did. Sorry, I lied. There's actually one that got back. Right. But out of the 9 tanks, 1 gets back. All the others sink. Right. Literally. Well, sorry. The ground at Ypres by August is absolutely saturated. The problem at Ypres is that you've got the water levels very high, and as soon as you start doing in the ditching that exists there and all the underground stuff, effectively the ground becomes like a quagmire. So even a First World War tank, which, as I say, a modern tank would be able to do it. In fact, even CBRT, those who put in with Scorpion and Scimitar, were marginal on that. Just don't get through. So literally, they disappear in the mud. And what they do is they send salvage teams out, poor old Chinese amongst others, who eventually recover those tanks, but it's a monstrous task.
So if they're in motion, they're all right. If they stop, they sink.
No, the problem is that you belly, and even with what's called an unditching beam, which is a beam that should be able to unbelly you, the mud is so viscous that you cannot unbelly. So literally, the tracks just do like that, and eventually you sink, right? Because the ground was completely saturated. They were unlucky. The weather was particularly bad. And eventually it does dry out a bit better. But there were infantrymen drowning in the mud, literally drowning in the mud. Appalling, the conditions they used.
At the beginning you said that the Germans were taken totally by surprise. How is it then that they, presumably building the Hindenburg Line, they built in anti-tank ditches? Were they anticipating it?
Because they'd, obviously, the Germans being thorough people, they'd looked at the limited use of tanks and decided that one of the obvious measures for stopping any threat from tanks was to simply build something that was wide enough. The Germans underestimated the tank threat because at Bullecourt, when they captured some tanks, we were so desperate for tanks that we were using training tanks. Training tanks are not made of armoured steel. They're made of soft steel. So the Germans thought that penetrating a tank was easy because by sheer bad luck they'd take the Mark II, and the Mark II you could penetrate them. But no, it's clear that the Germans, they didn't think that tanks were a very serious threat, but they thought that it was worth expending a little bit of time and energy. And immediately the Battle of Cambrai finishes, the first thing the Germans do is recover every single Mark IV tank they can from the battlefield, because there was a cock-up, and for some reason the tank corps didn't get the instruction to evacuate the hulks before the front line was put back. And most of the German tank corps tanks in 1918 are recovered Mark IV British tanks from the Battle of Cambrai, and the second tank-to-tank action in history is Mark IVs from the German army fighting Mark IVs from 12th Battalion Attack Corps. We win, by the way. That's a big sign on that.
What was the fuel capacity of those tanks?
About not as much as it should have been. About a couple of 100 litres. You could get about 25 miles. You had to change the tracks at any rate at 25 miles, and the sprockets. Right, it was a nightmarish task on there. You get about 25 miles out of it. On a Mark V, it was up to 50 miles, and they thought that was doing pretty well. And of course, there are no jerry cans for refilling, so you use small cans like the ones that we used at the beginning of the Second World War. Appalling exercise, and of course, it's normal petrol, it's not diesel. That's a quick aside on that.
Any more? Geoffrey, could you just say a quick word about what the atmosphere was like inside?
Sorry, I always take these things for granted, big attack man. On that, yeah, let me just try and... if you've got inside a Mark IV or a Mark I, or a Mark V for that matter, what you've got is a massive engine, which is about that sort of size, because to produce the same amount of power, I mean, no, you have a tiny little engine. It's about that sort of size.
Which way is the tank going?
So the tank's going that way. If you've got a gunner with a sponson on the side, he is standing roughly that far from the engine, and you don't touch the engine because the engine's boiling hot, of course, on there. So the driver and the commander are to the front, and of course the engine is venting carbon monoxide and all sorts of other nasty stuff. In fact, on the Mark V there was a design defect, so it literally evacuated carbon monoxide inside the crew compartment, and the crews were so inured to the whole exercise that they didn't actually notice it until quite late, and then they did some testing and they realised what was going on there. So that there is no suspension in the sense that there's no damping, so if, even at 3 miles an hour you're being bounced up and down on there, and any time there's no intercom, so to change gear what you did was either the commander or the gunner would get a spanner, and if you went bang bang, the secondary gearsman on that side would change gear, and if you went bang bang, the secondary gearsman on that side would change the gear. I have to say that even the top speed, if you got it up to 4th, would only take you to 3 miles an hour. So you're not exactly going to go so quickly. And in fact, there are stories of the drivers getting out of their own tanks and just letting a tank bimble on because they could walk faster than a tank could. You couldn't do that with a Mark V on that. So the environment is quite appallingly unpleasant, but if you do your statistics, 55% of tank crews were either killed or wounded between the 8th of August 1918 and the 6th of October. If you were in an infantry battalion in the Canadian Corps, and I take the Canadian Corps because they did a lot of fighting with tanks over the same period, your odds of being killed, I reckon, are about 95%. Killed or wounded. It's about 95%. And just in case you think that's bad, if you were in the 3rd British Infantry Division in the Second World War, and you landed at D-Day, and you reached the other end on the 5th of May, the end of the war, you had no statistical possibility of doing that because they suffered 13,000 casualties over that period, and in the equivalent period between D-Day and about August, they suffer about the same casualty level as the Canadians. So it's about 95%. So you're better off being in a metal box. Not much better off being in a metal box, but you are better off being in a metal box, interestingly, on that. And that's it. But the environment is one that you'll do 1 or 2 days, and that's about your limit. But truthfully, in the First World War, that's about the limit of most offensives, if one's honest about it. The Germans can sustain it a bit longer by using infiltration tactics.
What was the armament on the tank?
Either 2 6-pounder guns, which are about the same as the 6-pounders used in the Second World War on there. So the round's about that sort of size. Quite a chunky round, actually, with a solid shot head to start with, and then they had HE and case shot, which is the equivalent of a massive shotgun thing. Very good for clearing foliage and the men behind it, I have to say. And machine guns, and a mail tank carried, Mark IV carried about 320 rounds and about 5,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, so you weren't going to run out of ammo, although there are examples of tanks firing their entire load, I have to say. And a female tank carried 14,000 rounds of ammunition, and there are examples of female tanks firing every single round. Female tank has 4 machine guns, basically. The commander has 1, which is the 5th one, but he rarely uses that on there.
Geoffrey, how did the German artillery respond in terms of anti-tank defence?
Another very good question. The answer to that question is that the Germans reacted really quite quickly. The first thing they do is they, at Cambrai, if you talk to Jack Sheldon, who was the DA, British DA in Berlin, and has written a series of books about the German army, which are really good, he says we were incredibly unlucky at Cambrai. The only division in the German army that had systematically trained for its artillery to be anti-tank was the division sitting on the top of the Flequier Ridge. It was total bad luck. And it was a gunner commanding division, and he had seen French tanks attacking at a disastrous French battle. There's maybe a French here, but the Battle of Berry-le-Bac is an appalling disaster for the French, and the German artillery respond by knocking out the tanks, basically improvising it. By 1918, the Germans have a whole technique for knocking tanks out. Our countermeasure to that is smoke, lots of smoke. At Cambrai, there are massive smoke screens to block off the Flequier Ridge, but there's a cock-up in the timings, and the tanks advance too late, and the smoke screen is lifted on the other side. The other thing the Germans do is, in 1918, there's clearly some panic going on. They buy 13,000 anti-tank rifles. These are, you remember the boys' anti-tank rifle? You know, the thing that I can't fire because I would be physically flown backwards because I'm not big enough on there. 12.7mm, massive, like a massive rifle with a recoil of death on there. They issue 13,000, produce 13,000 of them. There is a strong suspicion that even the Germans thought there was a bit much in terms of recoil, because there's not much evidence they made much use of it. They use armoured bullets, but we up the armouring a bit on there. And the major problem inside the tank, if you're being fired up by a machine gun, First World War tank, is you get a thing called splash, which is tiny little shards of metal. And there's a description by Wilfrid Bion, who becomes a famous psychologist, of going into action on Flequier Ridge, and he's swearing at his men, he's firing his guns, and they're being shot up by German artillery and all this stuff. And he says, well, I'm sweating. And he goes like that in his face, and he looks at his hands, and they're covered in blood. Because it's blood pouring down his face from the little shards of metal that are coming off the machine guns firing at him, but not penetrating the tank, they're just sending shards of metal on the inside, out of the way, on there. And of course it's the Germans who learned the lesson that one of the more successful measures against tanks is of course tanks. Right. The Germans actually only produced 20 tanks in the First World War, A7Vs, probably the most useless tank ever built, I have to say. It's rather comforting to know that even the Germans can't get everything right. The A7V must be a bad tank because it's named after a committee. Think about that one. Who's going to name it? It's named after the Russian Transport Committee. And that's not a good idea for any tank, is it?
Were the soldiers, do they volunteer to become tank or were they conscripted?
The answer is that initially they were volunteers, and then a bit like the parachute regiment in the Second World War, if you're familiar, the later parachute regiments of the Second World War are actually units converted, and they had a high loss rate for doing that, obviously, but the structure was better. And what happens with the later battalions in the First World War for the Tank Corps is that they have a nucleus of trained crewmen, and then they take basically what good quality manpower is available. For example, miners were used in some of the later battalions because they were released from their mining roles on there, and they are then trained up as normal infantrymen and then given a supplementary batch of training. It's about 16 weeks for the infantry training, about the same for the crewman training, and they're usually conscripts by that stage. The cadre are volunteers. The cadre NCOs and officers are volunteers. The remainder are usually by that stage conscripts on there, because you can train them up reasonably easily. I say reasonably easily, it's much longer than training up an infantryman. It creates a major problem in 1918 about replacements, because the casualty rate is much larger than one might expect. There were 26 battalions forming by the end of the First World War, right, of which I'm doing tank spotting. Battalions 19 to 26 never went to war. They simply didn't have time to complete their training on that. That was from 1990.
A minute on Deborah.
A minute. Thank you very much for the prompt. Yep. Deborah, D51. If you go to Flequier, up on that ridge line, a hotelier in Cambrai, very good hotel called the Beauties, which I strongly recommend. It's in the Michelin non-star, so it's reasonably cheap on there. Not only is he run a very good restaurant, but he's the man who found a tank. About 20 years ago, he started looking for a tank, and he found an old lady in a village called Bullecourt who said, "There's a tank buried over there, mate." And of course, he took no notice of the old lady. He said, "Well, I can't believe that's true." And he then spent the next nearly 10 years going through the whole of the Cobra area, finding all the remnants of tanks, and I'm not joking. And he produced this magnificent map, which is at the back of his book, which has little dots showing you every single location of every single tank that was knocked out at the Battle of Cambrai. There were quite a lot of tanks knocked out at the Battle of Cambrai. And eventually he came back to where the little old lady said the tank was, because the little old lady was right. There was a tank at the bottom, and they dig a hole, and they find this tank. Now, of course, you might say, well, you find a First World War tank. It was in reasonable order. It had some quite heavy damage at the front on there. And about 3 weeks later, David Fletcher, who's this historian of the Tank Museum, gets hold of Philippe, of course, whom he knows, and says, "Philippe, I've just had the most extraordinary thing. A bloke called Heap has just sent me a picture of a tank, and it's your tank." Because otherwise we wouldn't have known what tank it was. And it's your tank. It's D51. It's called D51, and it's called Deborah. It was commanded by Lieutenant Heap, who wins an MC for it, and Tim Heap, who's his grandson, is very much alive and kicking, and is organising a whole series of things for the Philippe commemoration of the Battle of Cambrai, which is taking place on the 18th and 19th of November on there. And the town of Cambrai is building a museum at Fleckier, which will be is next door to Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery, where there are at least 4, there might be 5, of the crewmen that were killed in the tank, because Heat was only one of 3 people that survived on there, so that the tank crews are literally looking upon their tank, and a rather nice futuristic thing. And the centre of this is Deborah, the tank, on it with a whole thing of cyanide. In fact, I've just had to release 500 words on the Royal Tank Regiment, in some haste, I have to say, on what the regiment did, and there'll be a whole series of other things on there, so that one can go and have a look at it. It's a remarkable story, and the luck of being able to find actually the name, most of the crew. There's a very good book written by a man called John Taylor going into the detail of how they tracked down all, but I think they're now down to 1 crewman that they haven't found on there. They kept no crew lists, so it's incredibly difficult to find out. You get officers is reasonably easy because you get officers' listings, but they didn't keep crew lists for some reason, so it's quite difficult tracing individual crewmen, and they've done a remarkable job of doing it. And they will be out there, and we will be walking the track of Deborah and all the things that go with that on the 18th, 19th of November at Cobra. I just hope the weather is reasonable.
I believe there were a lot of dummy tanks used.
There were. At the end of the First World War, we were running out of tanks, and one of the measures that was done was to simply produce dummy tanks, and dummy tanks were enough at the end of the First World War to make the Germans withdraw. Right? Dummy tanks are used in large quantities in the Second World War on there, but in the First World War they're used often as substitutes for tanks. They were also used for some training early on where there were not enough tanks on that.
What was the REME support to maintain these tanks?
So I've been very careful how to phrase this. The REME were, of course, created in 1942 to assist elements of the Royal Armoured Corps in the maintenance of their vehicles. The Tank Corps had its own maintenance crews, and they were an integral part of the Tank Corps. And what happened was that actually in 1918, even at Cambrai, tank crews were sufficiently trained so that they did most of the changing of large components. And the role of the maintenance side was to take broken large components and repair them back in the tank administrative area, as I call it, on there. The disadvantage of that in 1918 is if you're moving forward, it meant that their repair system had been pushed rather too far back. But that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's the normal tension between the maintainers and the tank crews. The tank crews want all their maintainers next door to them. The maintainers quite reasonably think that there is economies of scale by having them slightly further back. So the answer is that the tank maintenance was done within the tank corps. It was a single process. They also dealt with all the spares. They also dealt with re-equipping the tanks. But tanks on that, it's not until 42 that you get the review. You get the review because it resolves the problem about maintenance within the Royal Armoured Corps in particular. I think that was diplomatic enough. Yep.
Just an observation really for Veer's information. Some of the research I was doing a few weeks ago, the first battle at Flers de Courcelette, one of the battalions involved in that, or at least one of the battalions, was from the 60th. So from early days the Green Jackets had an involvement in
Oh yeah,
actions.
and Wayne's VC is one supporting either KRRC or 60th at Cobra, because it's quite a large Rifle Brigade contingent, not surprising on there. So yes, as you'd expect.
Maybe time for one more.
You were saying that heavy tanks were used for crossing ditches and crushing barbed wire. I believe there were light tanks. What was that?
Yeah, there was a tank called the Whippet. The Whippet could do 8 miles an hour, which, by the way, is a horse at the gallop, according to the 1914 Field Service Manual, can do 15 miles an hour, but at the trot can only sustain about 8 on there. And that is fast. I mean, that is so fast that it will catch the Germans out. And it's so fast that the German anti-tank batteries can't cope with shooting at a tank doing 8 miles an hour on there. The only trouble about the Whippet is it was built in such a haste. It has 2 engines, so in order to change gear on a Whippet, you have to double declutch twice. How the hell a driver could ever do that? And they did do it. They did do it. They were taught to double declutch twice. Right, I can't imagine how you did it on there. They only built 200 of them, and the sad thing is that they completely cocked up the procurement of medium tanks. So what they then did is they decided they didn't like the Whippet, which was a medium A, so they try and build a medium B, a medium C, and a medium D, and you guessed it, none of them ever came into service. Right, the only medium B that was ever used is now sitting somewhere in Russia because it was captured by the Russians, because it was used in 1919 by ourselves. The Tank Corps can say that we're the only people who've ever taken Stalingrad. It wasn't called Stalingrad at the time, and we didn't do it for very long. On that.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we must draw it to a close there, so that you can get a drink. And Geoffrey, I'm sure you have thoroughly deserved a drink and a nibble as well. Thank you very much indeed. I don't think I've ever heard somebody talk in such detail and at such length and being able to answer such a wide range of questions without once looking at a note. Hugely impressive, and thank you very much indeed.